Hello, good afternoon. My name is Juan Felipe Rincon. I'm from the Google Search Quality team, and welcome to this week's installment of Basics of a Mobile Website for SMBs. This is a series of 4 presentations over the month of March, where we hope we'll be able to give you quick, actionable tips for you who probably own a website for a small, medium business, and that will allow you to very quickly either implement the changes yourself or have a very meaningful conversation with the people who do your web development so that you can be informed as to what actually it entails to create a mobile-friendly website. This is in preparation for an algorithmic change in mobile search results that we will be releasing in April 21st, at which point mobile-friendly websites will be given, the mobile friendliness of a website will be considered as a ranking factor in mobile search results. So this presentation will be about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will take questions presented through the Q&A feature of the Hangout on Air. You can click on the little Q&A bubble, ask a question, and we will make our best effort to answer it. And if we can't answer it on air today, we will answer it in the discussion thread of this Hangout. So let's get started. And actually, that's presented a different way. It's presented like this. Here we go. All right. And I have 2 colleagues here who are telling me whether or not we're actually displaying the full presentation. Great, excellent. So let's get started. We have for today's agenda, we will be talking about viewports, Zoom, and plugins. This is the second installment in a series of 4 presentations. Last Thursday, we talked about the tools you can use to check your website's mobile friendliness. And if you didn't get a chance to see the presentation, you can still see it on YouTube or here through the Google Webmasters community. You can check it out after this presentation, or you can catch this presentation afterwards as well, and then follow the 2 in sequence. Today, we will be talking about viewports, zooms, and plugins, as I mentioned. Viewports and zooms. I will explain what viewports and zooming, how viewports and zooming affect mobile friendliness, and then I'll explain very specific things you can do on your website to make that change. So first, let's show you a simple but typical web page that has the common features shown on a desktop website. You've seen your website might look somewhat like this, or you may have seen websites that look very much like this. It has a header, it has a navigation bar, a central part of content, a footer with a number of links, and usually it has a variety of pages that kind of follow a similar structure. Now, think about what happens or what has happened to you when you've tried to see this page on a smartphone. What you will often see is this. You will see the page completely zoomed down and squeezed into the browser. This is because the page is lacking a viewport meta tag. A viewport is a tag, an attribute in the header of the HTML document at the top of the page that tells the browser how to display that web page on a mobile device. When you don't have a viewport, or when a viewport isn't specified, the browser on a mobile device will try to render the page at what it considers to be a typical desktop screen width. And the general assumption is that you're in the 800 to 1000 pixels wide for a standard web page. And what it will do is it will reduce the whole page, zoom out completely so that it will actually all fit in the screen. What you end up having are tiny little buttons, tiny little text, and you basically have to almost swim into the page, if you will, have to pinch and zoom to try to get at the content. That's not a particularly mobile-friendly experience. Users will frequently cite that as one of the examples of the website just doesn't work on mobile. Think about it, when you've used a website like that, you have to zoom in, you have to scroll, you have to dab all over the place. It's hard to figure out where to tap. So the first step to actually making a mobile-friendly page is to actually including a meta viewport in the head of the document. It's a tag that you put inside the header tag or of your HTML document, and what you're telling the browser at that point is specifically that for this page you should treat the content as having the width equivalent to the width of the device and an initial scale of 1. The scale is the way that it correlates a virtual pixel, if you will, of the number of virtual pixels wide that the browser is with the actual resolution of the device. And that's how you're able to actually have a consistent display of a web page across multiple different types of mobile devices even though those devices may actually have different pixel resolutions of the screens. You may be able to get Retina displays on iOS devices to devices of particular pixel widths or densities, and you're getting more and more devices with greater pixel density. That doesn't necessarily mean that an eye can detect all of that without zooming in. So the viewport tag is a key component of telling the browser, render this page and don't try to zoom out on it. When you do that, that's the first step in making your web page mobile friendly. But as you can see here, if you've made previous design decisions on your web page, you may have to take additional steps. In this case, now you can see that the browser isn't trying to zoom the page all the way across. But in fact, if you were to look at this page, you'd have to scroll sideways and laterally to see it. So it's at full zoom, but you still have to scroll and drag laterally and sideways to use all of those pieces. So I'll talk now about what it is, what were the design choices that may actually cause your web page to look like this once you add a viewport tag. Generally speaking, this is a result of having fixed width elements inside your page. A fixed width element is a component, maybe it's a box, a header, an image that has had a fixed width set to it in the style sheet. And when you have a design that assumes a fixed width, it can actually yield a poor experience on a mobile device, because usually fixed widths don't accommodate for the narrower view of a mobile browser. And these are two examples of what a fixed width element can do on one mobile device. Let's say on one mobile device, it might actually look fantastic at 344 pixels wide, but in another one, it will actually be truncated and chopped. How does this happen? This happens because usually either within the actual attribute, somebody added a designer added the style element, or in the style sheet at the head of the document, in the cascading style sheet at the head of the document, a specific value was implemented. Firstly, you will hear in the rest of this discussion a discussion about CSS, cascading style sheets, and that is the recommended way of specifying how content should look on a page. You may have used web page management tools in the past that put a lot of style descriptions into each individual little element and page part of the page, and that's generally not a recommended practice. Usually you want to use CSS and style sheets and define those at the top of your document when relevant to indicate how the page should actually look and how it should actually be displayed. In any event, designers will often prefer fixed widths and specifying fixed widths for particular elements for design and layout. And this is actually perfectly fine. It's a well-accepted practice, and this can actually yield very good results. However, when you have elements with very wide fixed widths, it can make it more difficult for your website to be mobile friendly. And you may find yourself that you have this situation in your website, that you have a design that you developed a few years ago, or that somebody developed for you a few years ago. And if you are to look in the source code of the page, you might see a lot of elements that say width and then a big number NPX, which is pixels. And that usually is going to get in the way of being mobile friendly immediately. There's a straightforward way. There are two straightforward ways of addressing this, and then there's an additional one which combines the two. The first straightforward way to do it, which might be a little bit more work, is to actually make a change on all of those fixed widths, and instead of going with a fixed number of pixels wide that it can be, actually use a percentage of the window width that you might be. So if you want something to span all the way across the screen, you can specify 100%. If you want something that's just 80% that has a margin of 10% on either side, you might use a 10% margin on either side and then specify that something should be 80% the width of the screen or the containing element. That can actually be a very effective way of, over time, getting into a practice of not being stuck with a particular width, but actually having a design that adjusts to when the browser shrinks, or on a desktop shrinks, or expands the width of the browser screen, or to adjust for future mobile devices that may have completely different widths. This can get tricky though, because it could make your design more complicated, and it can make debugging your CSS for particularly fussy designs or layouts a little bit more tricky. So you have a second option, which is you don't touch all of the stuff that you already have that works on your mobile device, on your browser. I mean, on your desktop browser, and instead you use something called the @media queries, which is an attribute of cascading style sheets that tells it that everything inside those brackets would only apply to particular types of devices. So in this case, you can look at an @media screen and max width of 640px. What this is telling the browser that renders this page is say, look at this style sheet, and then if you happen to be on an actual screen as opposed to other media types like print, if you happen to be displaying this page on a screen and you are in a window that has a maximum width of 640 pixels, then apply these style attributes as well, and maybe override the ones that you saw above. In this case, what are we specifying? For example, we're saying that in the upper part for standard, just set the width of the body at 1024 pixels, and set the images inside the main content paragraph to have a width of 80%. And in this case, what we're telling it is, when you are on a screen that is no wider than 640 pixels, make the body width 100% of the width of the screen, and make the main image having a width of 100% as opposed to 80%. And with that as well, you can override some other elements. For example, we're doing a couple more things here. We're saying there's a home button in the main navigation screen, for example. And instead of wanting it to be a tiny little button on the left of a nav bar, what we're going to want to do is move it to the top and to the right. And so we're adding an absolute positioning, and we're giving it a position that's 1% from the top and 1% to the right, and giving it a different color, just to show that you can apply not just different widths, but different colors, schemes, and positioning for elements depending on your screen width. This allows you to then have a page that is actually responding to your device's width. So here we have an example of this exact same page we had before, where we have a viewport that's defined to match the width of the device, and where we adjusted the heights, the widths, and the positions of certain elements only on a mobile device and on our mobile page. You can see, for example, that the little home icon is on the top right now, as opposed to on the left next to catalog. We can see that the footer is actually fixed at the bottom, so if you scroll the page up and down, these links will always remain there. We added a couple of other practices. And the best part about this approach is that we didn't have to change how it looks on the desktop. So we haven't affected our desktop display. We're optimizing for mobile friendly. We're making a mobile friendly web page, and we haven't actually fundamentally changed how the web page behaves on a desktop, which can might actually alleviate some concerns that you might have, or that your developers might bring in about saying, well, we might be affecting how the web page operates on the desktop. You can do this on the same page just using style sheets. This gives you two things. One is, again, you can have a mobile friendly page without having to change your desktop site, and on the other hand, you can actually have the same page working on multiple devices, which is much easier to manage, much less expensive to manage than to try to manage two different websites, one for mobile devices and one for desktop devices, and maybe even another one for tablets. So we talked about viewports and zooms, and now there's one additional piece I want to talk to you about, which is plugins. Generally speaking, how many times have you ever tried to view a page on a mobile and seen this? It's a little icon that says this plugin is not supported. Avoid unsupported plugins. Make sure that you test your application and your web page on a mobile device. Make sure that you're not using things that aren't supported on a mobile device, because ultimately you're going to end up with users that can't actually use your website. Sometimes there have been plenty of websites. This used to be a very common practice years ago, of just using a big flash presentation as the main source, that created a lot of interactive, very animated schemes for the user, and it was very pretty, but it's not machine readable. It's just visual. And what that meant is that, first of all, on a user that was on a device that didn't support Flash, they couldn't access it. On a mobile device in particular, you can't access it. If you are using things like videos on your website, test them to make sure that you're not relying on a Flash plugin, but that you're instead relying on core video elements, HTML5 video elements that may be supported and are supported on all mobile devices. And if you can, add captions and add text descriptions to videos and other elements, so that users who might have chosen to turn off video, or cannot see video because they're on a low bandwidth or slow network, or they don't want to use up their mobile data traffic, can still get a sense as to what content you have on your site. And that concludes today's presentation and the formal part of our presentation. I want to encourage you to do a few things. First, take the mobile-friendly test on your website if you haven't already. I encourage you to visit the Webmaster's Mobile Guide to read in more detail about the topics that I've discussed today. I'm walking you through the different tests that the mobile-friendly test tool will run on your site and the explanations that we provide. If you want more detail more quickly and can't wait until next Thursday to see what other fun things the mobile-friendly test has in store, go to the Webmaster's Mobile Guide. We'll guide you through that. And if you need help with your site, if you really are struggling, you don't know where to begin, you don't know where to start, we have a fantastic community on the Google Webmasters Forum, where you have a very helpful set of both Googlers and other community members that will be happy to give you advice and guidance as to how to proceed. I encourage you to take advantage of these resources. Also, if you're visiting this, you're probably already following us on Google Webmasters and Google+. If you aren't, definitely I encourage you to do so. And follow us on Twitter. We post announcements both on the Google+ channels as well on Twitter, announcements, news, and invitations to future events. And with that, we will be shifting over to questions and answers for the remaining part of the presentation. So let's go to Q&A. We have in store. All right, let's pick the first question. This is a question from Renee Demont. As smartphones get higher screen resolutions, such as the Galaxy X, with which viewport does Google recommend for a modern mobile-friendly website? And how are these phones seen when using Google search? You want to think more about the device width property in your browser than the actual physical pixel resolution of the device, because browsers have by and large settled on a virtual pixel width, if you will, that maps the physical pixels on the device to a virtual pixel on the browser. That allows you to have a consistent set of mobile devices that run the spectrum of sizes and just a little bit of aspect ratios without having to worry too much about the proportions. Generally speaking, you do want to think about, when it comes to devices with super high resolutions, on whether you want to actually include two versions of your images and respond to that in terms of providing much higher resolution images. Sometimes you can get really visually enriching experiences on super high resolution displays like the Retina displays or so on. If you provide much higher double width or double density resolution images for background images, you can get a lot more visual depth in that. That's a little bit more of an advanced technique, but if you Google something like Retina display or high density background images, you'll be able to get a good perspective on that. But by and large, the viewport setting that we're recommending here will allow you to cover the broad range of positions, because you're not specifying a particular width. You're just saying, give me the device width and assume that when I talk about a pixel in the CSS, it's one of the virtual pixels in the browser. I hope that answers the question. Let's go to the next one. So here's a question from Lukasz Trzynowski. Your suggestions are great, but what when we have most of these already added and our ranking is still bad? Then we go back to the basics. Mobile friendliness isn't going to somehow make a bad website good. And that doesn't mean that if your ranking those aren't what you would want it to be, that your website isn't good. But you want to focus then on the quality of your content. Are you giving your users the content that you want, that they're looking for? Are you responding to the things that they're searching for? And when they land on your page, are you actually giving them something that encourages to both come back and recommend your site, your content, your service to other people? This isn't going to fix basic ranking issues. You still have to think about the core guidelines that we always provide when it comes to ranking. Focus on content quality, focus on providing good user experience, focus on following our webmaster guidelines, and that should get you across the board. But this is definitely not going to. This isn't going to address a systemic problem, but this is definitely going to allow you to provide a good experience on mobile if you don't already have one. I hope that addresses that. Okay, here's another question from Lukasz, and I'll follow that one as well. We implemented responsive design for a website. All looks good on mobile, Chrome, and Firefox, but the footer is missing in Fetch and the render tool and Google Webmaster Tools. Why? You don't support display block CSS command? In That shouldn't, I have no reason to believe that we don't actually support display block and CSS command. We do render the pages, and based on everything I've seen on websites I've built where I actually physically use display block for defining how the browser should render a particular CSS element, a particular element based off of that CSS command. There's no reason to believe that we don't actually support it. What would be important to do is actually look at your specific page and then figure out whether or not there's something about how that page is displaying, how that page is being seen by Googlebot in rendering that causes that to not appear. I don't have any reason to believe that that would actually affect the mobile friendliness perspective of your page, but I certainly would encourage you to take that specifically to our webmaster forums, where we might be able to take a look at it in a little bit more detail. Hope that answers that. Here's a question. What is an OK score on page speed insights? I'll answer this question a little bit differently. Instead of aiming for what's just good enough, think about all of the recommendations in both mobile-friendly tests and page speed insights as really well-distilled best practices that have been gathered by both good web practitioners, Googlers, and folks who've been in the web industry for a very long time. It's sort of almost fundamentally basic things to having a great website. There aren't a whole lot of things in those recommendations that are really things you should skip. There are some things that you can get away with, but ultimately you're not providing the best experience to your users, and you're missing out on basic things you can do to really address very systemic problems. So I would not necessarily treat it as what's a good enough score, but rather saying if you haven't already gotten to the point where you're addressing the criticals and the you should fixes, you're probably not doing all you can do to give your users the best experience. All right, I hope that addresses that. Here's another question. This is a question from Claire. In Google developers and many other credible sources, I have seen that it is not recommended to use maximum scale on a responsive site. Would this negatively affect ranking mobile friendliness if this was kept on the website? If the mobile friendly test labels you as having a mobile friendly page and mobile friendly websites, then for the perspective of mobile friendly ranking, you should be fine. When it comes to not using maximum scale on a responsive site, following that recommendation, I think the main key you want to focus on is if you are making a design choice that is making it difficult for users to actually interact with your page, if the first thing I have to do when I land on your web page is start zooming in and swimming into it to actually get at elements, if I can't actually tap on the things that allow me to convert, to act, to take that business, to sort of do the thing that you want me to do on your website, I might not come back, or I might not actually do it. So think about whether or not you're sticking with the choice of actually staying with maximum scale. If you have, I assume you'd have good reasons to do so. Think about whether or not that's also helping your users accomplish that. If that's the case, then by and large, your users will be happy, and as long as you've addressed the whatever elements are defined in the mobile-friendly test, you should be fine. And hoping that answers the question as well. All right. Let's see. This is a question that I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I hope we answered it. How do I lock a viewport so it's the same on any device and is even possible? What I would say is that if you define the viewport indicator on the pages we're recommending, what you're telling the browser is just look at just don't try to scale my page, or don't try to do some magic adjustment so that things fit in here. Just assume that when I'm talking about a CSS pixel, I'm talking about one of the pixels that the browser understands. But I'm not sure if that's actually addressing your question. If that wasn't your question, I'd invite you to re-ask the question. Maybe we might end up in the forum or even on the discussion thread, and we might be able to get to it. All right, let's see from Boda Klubunsky. Is having an m.dot site okay for ranking, and the GCLID URL path, is that okay, or should I remove it? I'll go on the m.dot site. On the m.dot site, it shouldn't be an issue. The thing is, it can make things a lot more difficult for you. If you do, we will have in the fourth installment on this discussion, we will be talking about canonicalization, which is how you map URLs on your m.dot sites to your main page and to sort of show which ones are corresponding results for one and the other. That can actually, that's doable and feasible, but it can be tricky to manage. It can be a little bit complex to keep sorted on an ongoing basis. So when it's okay for ranking, it's for your m.dot site. That's as long as your website is giving value to users on mobile devices or even on non-mobile devices, it should be fine. But think about whether or not you want to maintain that over the long term. And if you're committed to that, then definitely make sure you're properly canonicalizing your URLs and doing proper mapping between your mobile and your desktop, so that crawlers know which one is which page is a corresponding page to another one, so that when we're calculating page relevance, we understand those things well. Let me look at the next one, please. Let's see. Here's a question from Steve Cooper. This is one that comes up a fair amount. We use several third-party tools like social sharing buttons, and it's recommended that we minify the code to speed things up, but it's not our code to change. Recommendations. Generally speaking, my experience has been with using social sharing buttons and things that large providers will create. They will often provide those resources already minified. So look through the resources through which you actually obtain this code, whether it's by the provider, whether it's Google or Facebook or Twitter or any other social networking sites or other sites that you're using, and look as to whether or not they actually give you a .gz or even a .min version of that JavaScript code. My experience has been that they usually will provide that, because that's just a good practice for everybody. It's good for web hosts. It's good for them. If they're serving it, they don't want to be serving more webs than they need to. And if you're not able to do that, then the follow-on piece is consider loading that JavaScript at the foot of the page, not in the head of the page, but in the foot, or consider it loading it asynchronously, so that you're not blocking the rendering of the page until that loads, until those scripts load. Those are not fundamental to the first things that users are going to be doing on your page. You may want to consider putting those at the foot, and that may also help address that concern. All right, let's say this is a question from Jochen Froelich. What width do you recommend as a safe breakpoint for a smartphone version? I've used, you can see both 320 and 600 and I want to say 80 used as very common breakpoints. Those generally tend to fit different types of devices. If you think behind the principle of responsive design, the answer should be, don't worry so much about the devices and the smartphone versions. Think about how to design your page so that at logical widths it functions, and therefore how to adjust flexibly so that whatever buffers you need on the sides are actually not all that important. So if you think about how can this page work when you are listing it as a long narrow column, how can this page look when you're seeing it on a very large browser, how does this page look when you're both wide and tall, and think about the layout of that page that way, then you might actually land on natural breakpoints that fit within sort of a narrow smartphone, a wider smartphone, a tablet, and a desktop browser. That's more of the principle of the question. But if you want a pixel number, generally we'd be sitting in the mid-600s range, and it'll depend on which devices you think are going to be more prevalent for your device. But it's we've been showing 640 and 680. I think we settled 680 recently. Hope that answers that question. Here's another question from Specialized Digital Marketing. How to best get rid of render blocking Java and CSS in the header? Put it lower down. Put it in the footer. You can put the script element pretty much anywhere on your page, as long as CSS can be render blocking, but you can actually put non-render blocking CSS further down. And JavaScript doesn't have to be render blocking, but the loading of that can actually, if the loading of the JavaScript is fundamental to the display of your page, let's say that you're actually doing something JavaScript that's modifying the look of the page, you want to load that code quickly, but then everything else that may be plugins or additional components, so on, you can just put them lower in the page, and that way all the other resources necessary to render your page are loaded first and parsed first. Let's see. Here's a question from Jasvinder Singh. My site is mobile friendly, but having 13 resources which are blocked by robots.txt. Will it be a problem? Do I have to fix it or not? Thank you. If those resources are critical for Googlebot to actually see your website as mobile friendly, then that will be an issue because we will not be able to know that your page is mobile friendly. So if your CSS is blocked, if your JavaScript is blocked, if the images that are necessary for your mobile friendly layout to work are not crawlable by Google, then we will not be able to see, Googlebot will not be able to see that your page is mobile friendly. So that will get in the way. The general thing we're asking is let us crawl your JavaScript, let us crawl your CSS, and let us view your page like a browser would view the page. And if you're able to let us let Googlebot do that, then we'll be able to determine if your page is mobile friendly. Here's another question from, I'll have time for one more question. And let's ask from this specific question from Dave, which we saw earlier, which I thought made sense, from Dave Griffiths. Website is marked as mobile friendly in mobile search, which means it has passed the mobile test, and the CSS and JavaScript are not blocked by robots.txt, but there's a separate mobile version at /mobile, which is blocked by robots.txt and doesn't have canonicals and alternate tags on the desktop, on desktop and mobile versions. Is this a problem? I would say it is. It's a problem to the extent that you actually want pages on your desktop site and your mobile sites to be considered equivalent. Because it can actually be particularly irritating. If I'm in a mobile browser and I find a page that is relevant to my results, and it's a desktop page, I go to that desktop page and you redirect me not to the right page. That's not a great experience. And the second thing is Google will actually identify whether or not you properly do a redirect and skip that redirect. And if you're sending me out to the wrong page, that may also be a problem. If you put in the right canonicals and alternate tags, then it actually allows Googlebot to say, hey, here's this page that ranks, or here's this page that's relevant. Here's the other page that's corresponding to it, may actually be mobile friendly. This page may be equivalent to this one. Let's try this one. Let's take them to this because this is the mobile page. I would say if you do need to have two mobile websites, the first thing is if Googlebot can't call JavaScript and CSS, Googlebot can't tell you're mobile friendly. And if you don't have good canonicalization or alternate, then you may be missing out on relationships and common understanding of those pages, telling Google these pages are actually equivalent, treat them similarly, which may actually be affecting some of the results that you get in terms of users going to your site. We didn't have the time to answer all the questions during this broadcast, but we'll take the remaining questions and answer them in the discussion thread. Again, thank you for taking the time. I hope this has been useful and valuable to you, and we look forward to talking to you in the next iteration of this next Thursday afternoon. We have 2 more sessions along the lines. In the meantime, if you want to get started on making these changes and want some support, the Webmaster Mobile Guide is there. I encourage you to take the mobile-friendly test and follow the advice, and go to our Google Webmaster forums for questions and support. There are plenty of helpful people who are happy to give you assistance. Thank you for your time, and good luck. Take good care. Bye-bye.